In tomorrow's world, once zero trust is implemented in, say, retail, everything will be behind plexiglass doors with a 3D camera.
Engineers and scientists from Columbia University promoted what they thought was going to be the replacement for capitalism and free enterprise.
We're going to end hunger, which again is just window dressing. You realize that this is actually a blank check for totalitarian global control. You have to learn to speak what I call UNEs. You have to know what the terms mean if you want to truly understand what is being discussed. When they talk about peacekeeping forces or the peacekeeping role of the United Nations, they're actually talking about the war-making capabilities of the United Nations. So you have this Orwellian doublespeak. When they talk about transparency, more often than not, they're talking about eliminating your privacy. Human rights is another very, very good example. They make very clear in this document that your rights can be restricted under the guise of public order or morality or whatever the case may be. And so they're saying, here's your rights, but by the way, they're not really rights. We can revoke them at any time. The UN is filled with contradictions like this. So, for example, when they talk about gender equality, right? A normal person in the Western world thinks gender equality means a woman has a right to earn money, to own property, to have all the rights and privileges that a man would have. When you look at the individuals who lead this movement within the UN, you're talking about radical feminists. You're talking about people who are very interested in dissolving the nuclear family. As you dig into these goals, it's very clear we're dealing with something far more nefarious. Once you look past the marketing slogans, the kind of warm and fuzzy, we're going to end hunger, which again is just window dressing, you realize that this is actually a blank check for totalitarian global control.
Author and campaigner, the late Rosa Koire, called out the plan more than a decade ago.
It is the biggest public relations scam in the history of the world. But it's far more than that. It's a blueprint. It is the action plan to inventory and control all land, all water, all minerals, all plants, all animals, all construction, all information, all energy, all means of production, and all human beings in the world.
What can be measured can be managed, and ultimately monetized. In fact, a study at Yale University has calculated that the natural assets of the world are worth $5 quadrillion. Is this the basis of the new world monetary system? And is it the deep underlying reason for the United Nations project to rewild 50% of the Earth by 2050?
They talk a lot about biodiversity. They want you to think, like, oh, we're going to preserve the toucans and the parrots and the whatever lizards. But when you actually dig into this, what they're talking about is creating, and they're working on it now, an international database with virtually all of the genetic material of all of the species on the planet. And then they want to start mixing and matching it. Bill Gates, ultimately, and his buddies want to end up in total control over all life on the planet.
Is it a coincidence, then, that Bill Gates has become the largest private landowner in America while planning to build smart cities in which to corral the general population? What is indisputable is that the oligarchs of global business are embedded in United Nations policy.
They don't care about the planet. They care about getting in. Finance goes to where it gets the greatest return. There's a move into the green finance. It's all about profit. It's not about the planet.
This is not conjecture. Under the guise of climate change and net zero, vast fortunes are already being amassed. Take carbon exchange markets. Companies emitting excess carbon dioxide can buy credits from businesses that are carbon negative. But increasingly, many are paying a high price to offset their emissions against land schemes. Grasslands, forests, conservation projects, and so on. Some legitimate, others not so. Either way, the brokers and middlemen get rich, while having no impact on actual carbon emissions. We've also seen the emergence of natural asset companies, whose name says it all.
They identify the asset and then issue shares in that asset out of thin air, essentially. And they can sell it to financial institutions, asset managers, sovereign wealth funds. And then they go public and have an IPO, and that funding is, they say, meant to preserve the natural asset. But elsewhere, they say that their main purpose, like so much else, is to generate profit for shareholders. It has nothing to do with preserving the environment. That is literally just the talking point they think will stick and sell. We're all in it together. We got to save the planet. So let's allow the bankers to create a new racket that makes the natural world collateral.
So if everything in nature is to be traded on financial markets, setting a value on the land we walk on and the air we breathe, why do we, the public, have no say?
There's no route that an ordinary person can take to make a representation to the United Nations. So it's fundamentally undemocratic. What it has done is build relationships with billionaires.
Right from the start, the rich and powerful have enjoyed undue influence in the UN's inner sanctum. In fact, the Rockefeller family part-financed its headquarters in Manhattan.
Hand you, Mr. Lee, my father's check. Thank you, Mr. Rockefeller.
Between them, the Rockefeller family has funded hundreds of organizations and, as a consequence, spread their authority on civil society, institutions, banking, education, and global politics. The Rockefellers always believed in world governance. In the 1950s, their Special Studies Project report declared,
"The UN stands, finally, as a symbol of the world order that will one day be built."
In 1973, David Rockefeller co-founded a non-governmental organization which still carries international power today, the Trilateral Commission. Its stated objectives revived technocracy and in turn planted the seeds of the UN's Sustainable Development Agenda.
They said at the time that they were going to create a new international economic order. It was all over the literature. The goal of the new international economic order was not to get richer in the sense of money. They knew even back then that eventually the fiat currency system of the world was going to disintegrate. So the goal became to actually capture the physical resources of the world. All wealth historically has come out of the ground. They wanted to take away everything that they could possibly take away from the nation states of the world and from private individuals of the world and stuff it into the global common trust where they would administrate it, and they would be the ones getting licenses for the resources to turn around and make stuff.
The financial kingpins have long seen themselves as masters of the universe, manipulating global affairs through institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Is Agenda 2030 the defining act for complete control? And how significant was the global response to COVID-19?
As the world builds back from COVID-19, we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make investments that will strengthen the economy and improve public health, and fight climate change for generations to come.
One might ask, or why Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, who called for a new global monetary system, is the UN's special envoy for climate action and finance. And then there's Larry Fink, the boss of BlackRock, the world's largest asset management company. He's a board member of the World Economic Forum, and as we'll see, has driven the UN's goals through investment strategies for the past 20 years. All three are principles of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, a partnership with the UN. With the green economy worth trillions to corporations and investors alike, It's hard not to see a conflict of interests. Are the bankers raising money to achieve United Nations goals? Or are the goals a Trojan horse to change the world's financial control systems? Now consider the events at Jackson Hole, Wyoming in August 2019, only 3 months before the COVID outbreak. It's when Mark Carney delivered his call for change, and BlackRock proposed a new financial mechanism, Going Direct, which in principle allows central banks to channel capital direct to large corporations.
So the central bankers got together in 2019, the G7 central bankers, and voted on the Going Direct Reset. And the Going Direct Reset, of which the COVID operation was part of it, has done a phenomenally excellent job of massively consolidating capital into central control. If you look at the COVID operation from a financial standpoint, it was absolutely clear that it was one way you balance the books. It worked.
The major corporations like Amazon and others were allowed to continue business. Meanwhile, other businesses, particularly small and medium-sized entities, were deemed to be, quote, inessential. Many of them were put out of business. And so what we saw was a global wealth transfer of a reported $3.3 trillion from the working classes and the middle classes to this kind of super rich billionaire brigade.
The people who ran the operation made an absolute fortune. It was economically, as a taking, it was a huge taking.
And that included billions of pounds of taxpayers' money going to pharmaceutical firms for so-called vaccines. Whatever the truth around COVID, Dr. Hughes says the response deployed dangerous elements of social control, what he calls weaponized deception.
We see techniques of shock and awe being applied through the lockdowns, techniques of isolation, making reality seem strange and threatening. All of this helps to de-pattern the mind. These are all well-known military tactics.
Look them in the eyes and tell them you're doing all you can to stop the spread of COVID-19. Stay home, protect the NHS, save lives.
These are, in fact, very nasty and very vicious techniques which were deployed against the public of multiple countries at once. These are forms of serious psychological abuse. I think once the public starts to understand that, there's going to be a very severe pushback against everything that's happened.
The general population cannot fathom the psychopathy of the vision that they're facing. So they can't fathom that a group of people would organize and engineer this kind of mass atrocity to get where they want to go.
Be aware then of the World Health Organization, the UN's most powerful agency. Since COVID, the WHO has sought to increase that power to unprecedented levels through amendments to its pandemic treaty and the international health regulations. A key driver is its One Health initiative.
One Health is a concept that was created to enable the WHO, with these documents, to take over jurisdiction of everything in the world by saying that climate change, animals, plants, water systems, ecosystems are all central to health.
That places the Director General in a key position to influence world events, another potential conflict of interests given the WHO's financial backing, particularly from the pharmaceutical sector. Its accounts for 2022 show that an eye-watering 84%, or $3.656 billion of income, came from voluntary donations. The top 4 sources of these donations included the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Gavi, a public-private vaccine alliance also heavily supported by Gates.
People see the WHO as a benign organization, and there are still areas where the WHO does useful stuff. But the biggest focus now is purely on a tiny disease burden where investors can extract a large amount of wealth. This has shifted the WHO's focus very much to this emergency agenda, which is very false. Pandemics are very rare events.
This is why we now have a WHO that promotes vaccines all the time, because that's what the money is coming in to support. So instead of being a World Health Organization, we have a World Vaccine Organization, and that seems to be the only thing they're touting.
What's in the treaty has got nothing to do with health. It's a business deal focused on the most profitable business imaginable, pandemic profiteering.
The other part of it, they're setting up a huge surveillance network. We're talking about $31 billion a year. They have to surveil for variants of viruses, and they will find them. They just have to decide there's a threat, not even a real harm.
Experts are preparing for what is known as Disease X, or the next pandemic virus.
They're creating a supranational, self-perpetuating pandemic industry.
The latest scare is monkeypox, renamed Mpox, a disease highly unlikely to affect the general population. Nevertheless, the WHO has acted.
The emergency committee met and advised me that, in its view, the situation constitutes a public health emergency of international concern.
If you get to declare the emergency and then profit from it, there's a big problem, isn't there?
It's essentially a build-out of big pharma, and the WHO is essentially looking to be their marketing and distribution arm worldwide.
We're fighting for really the right to own our own lives. We're fighting for that freedom versus sort of corporate authoritarian structure or medical fascist structure, which is what is clearly interests are trying to impose on us.
Changes to the WHO's regulations are expected to be voted through in the coming months. As we speak, the UK government is fully behind them. Meanwhile, in common with many other global institutions, the WHO tries to silence criticism and dissent, branding it misinformation. The science, it says, is settled.
Digital platforms are being misused to subvert science and spread disinformation and hate to billions of people. This clear and present global threat demands clear and coordinated global action.
I have a little rule of thumb for diagnosing a centralization scam. If we can detect 1, a propagandized global crisis, 2, admitting only global solutions, and 3, with dissenting voices viciously silenced, then we know with absolute certainty that we are dealing with a scam.
Control, dictate, eliminate debate, the hallmarks of a totalitarian regime. And nowhere is the cold ambition of corporate dominance more evident than with the World Economic Forum. Klaus Schwab founded the WEF in 1971. His mentor was Henry Kissinger, statesman, political shaper, and close confidant of the Rockefellers. The organization now employs 800 people and has programs in business, academia, and in training future global leaders. It's far more than its famous annual meeting in Davos.
Over the last 50 years, the World Economic Forum has blossomed into an enormously influential organization with all of the major corporations as stakeholders or trustees and all funding the World Economic Forum to ultimately fund the UN World Government Plans and Agenda 2030.
Klaus Schwab is the public face of stakeholder capitalism, a planned system of central ownership and control that has little to do with democratic process and is uncomfortably close to communism. It's a partnership between global corporations, governments, and what Schwab refers to as civil society, NGOs, and so-called think tanks. The agenda is driven by finance, which gives the unelected and unaccountable oligarchs huge influence, if not control, over policy. The UK's Prime Minister, himself a one-time member of the Trilateral Commission, has already declared his interest.
You have to choose now between Davos or Westminster.
Davos.
Why?
Because Westminster is too constrained. And, you know, it's closed and we're not having meaning. Once you get out of Westminster, whether it's Davos or anywhere else, you actually engage with people that you can see working with in the future. Westminster is just a tribal shouting place.
Starmer seems to forget that he is elected by the people, to serve the people, through Parliament. That's his democratic duty. And while he refuses to listen to our farmers, he entertains the globalists in Downing Street and publicly doubles down on his philosophy.
I'm determined to deliver growth, create wealth, and put more money in people's pockets. This can only be achieved by working in partnership with leading businesses like BlackRock to capitalize on the UK's position as a world-leading hub for investment.
To underline the influence of non-elected, unaccountable policy drivers, consider this document from 2004. It was commissioned by the UN and produced by financial institutions, including the World Bank. It cited research by the WEF. The result was the emergence of environmental, social, and governance metrics, ESGs.
The ESG is an attempt to turn financial power into governance without going through the democratic process, without the normal process of making law.
ESGs allow major asset management companies such as BlackRock to impose ideologies on businesses and consumers across the world through their investment strategies. BlackRock's billionaire chairman and CEO, Larry Fink, also a board member of the WEF, remember, is clear.
You have to force behaviors. If you don't force behaviors, whether it's gender or race or just any way you want to say the composition of your team, you're going to be impacted.
Now we get ethics, green ethics, racial ethics, gender ethics, driving corporate decisions about who may have money, what they may use their money for, and how they're going to behave in society and what they're going to do with it. This is a new form of political power that isn't accountable, isn't transparent, and it isn't democratic.
We, the public, are being manipulated. Our lifestyles, our culture, and our future, be it through forced woke ideologies, intrusive technologies, so-called pandemics, censorship, or information which is too often propaganda. Your compliance is vital to the agenda. To impose global solutions, the leadership needs you to believe in global problems.
Climate change is here, it is terrifying, and it is just the beginning. The era of global warming has ended, the era of global boiling has arrived.
This stuff is so fantastically stupid. It's hard to believe that they're doing it. There is no climate emergency. That is a total scam. If they came out and said, hey, we want to destroy your economy, we want to destroy the middle class of your country, and then ultimately we want to make you a slave to a one-world government, it just wouldn't be as appealing as saying we're trying to save the planet for future generations.
With the hottest day on record and the hottest months on record, this is almost certain to be the hottest year on record. And the masterclass in climate destruction.
Statements such as that are amplified by emotional footage from all over the world. But is any of it true?
I do not think there's a climate crisis. We actually use satellites to monitor the global temperature, the true global temperature of the atmosphere. And we find there is a rise. It's about 1.5 degrees per century, which is certainly something that's manageable and the Earth has seen before. Compared to the 19th century, which was about the coolest century in the past 10,000 years, we're warmer. but we're about the same as we were 1,000 years ago, and certainly cooler than we were about 5,000 to 8,000 years ago.
John Christie is a highly regarded climate scientist who developed the measurement of accurate temperature records using satellites. His evidence is critically inconvenient to the climate change industry.
I'm not popular in most of the climate community, that's for sure, because much of the climate community depends on climate model results. Tens and hundreds of millions of dollars have gone into that industry of climate modeling, and I show, well, you folks have failed. But yet they prop up the entire political world that tends to support this. In 2017, I came to work and there were 7 bullet holes in our office suite. And so some people are pretty upset that the evidence that we build and show that can stand the test of time and can stand up to cross-examination is just not going along with their issues and their desires.
So let's consider these statistics on the Earth's atmosphere. 78% is nitrogen, 21% oxygen, other gases make up less than 1%, and carbon dioxide accounts for a mere 0.04%, the majority of which is natural. Can man-made CO2 really be a problem?
Roy Spencer and I are going on the assumption that all the warming that you see is due to carbon dioxide emissions. And so we find that that's a pretty modest warming. But see, that's a big assumption. Mother Nature is able to warm up the planet without extra CO2. And so we are just saying the worst case scenario is this warming of about 1.5 degrees. And that's certainly not a catastrophe at all.
On the contrary, carbon dioxide is vital for the world's survival. The greater the concentration, the better plants grow. In fact, according to NASA figures, the world has become 14% greener in the last 40 years.
During the last cool period before industrialization, let's say 200 years ago or so, it was below 300 parts per million. And during the ice ages, it was even lower. And that's a dangerous level because plants struggle to survive when the CO2 is at a low level. And so the biosphere becomes less diverse and less available to support the animal life. So low CO2 is not good for the planet as a whole.
Where is the logic then behind the UK's decision to spend £22 billion on facilities to capture carbon? The greatest controversy of all revolves around readings from ice cores. CO2 levels can be measured in bubbles of air trapped in ice thousands of years ago. By aligning this to temperatures, scientists have argued that carbon dioxide is the cause of global warming. However, closer inspection leads to the opposite conclusion.
Once the temperature starts to rise, you will see the carbon dioxide rise about 500 to 1,000 years after. So the CO2 actually lags the temperature changes.
But what of the extreme weather events which are increasing and driven by climate change according to everyone from the top of the United Nations down? Professor Christie says there is no data to support those claims.
What we find is that virtually every one of these claims is false. The extremes are not increasing. Hurricanes are not increasing in intensity or frequency. Same with tornadoes or thunderstorms or floods or droughts. It's just going along like it always has with the natural variability.
Why aren't we looking at the surface data sets that are constantly adjusted upwards? Why aren't we looking at the 40.3 record at Conisbee, which the Met Office is very proud of, on July the 19th in 2022? And when we did a free information request at the Daily Sceptic, we found that there were 3 Typhoon jets landing on a runway next to the measuring device, because Conisbee, as they call it, is actually RAF Conisbee. It's a military airport. The temperature lasted for 60 seconds. Sticking a thermometer up the backside of a jet aircraft is not probably scientifically the best place that you can sort of determine temperature measurement, particularly when you then morph it into a global database, which the Met Office has, and then tell dear old Antonio Gutierrez that the globe is boiling. The whole thing is junk.
How we came to the point where we think that we're going to prevent bad weather from happening by eliminating fossil fuels is just about the most nonsensical, illogical thing that I can imagine. And the whole world is caught up in this nonsense.
So how did the carbon story take hold? Meet the man who invented climate change, according to The Telegraph. His name? Maurice Strong, an oil tycoon, a Rockefeller associate, and a man with an extraordinary talent for moving between high finance, politics, and the United Nations. Strong was a member of the highly influential Club of Rome, an institution formed in 1968 at a Rockefeller property on Lake Como in Italy. A group of scientists, academics, and industrialists discussed what they saw as an urgent crisis: the impact of human activity on the planet.
I don't think we can sustain current growth trends much beyond, say, the lives of children who are being born today.
To prove the thesis, they commissioned computer modeling at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This research laid the foundations for an agenda that's persisted for over 50 years.
Cut use of autos, use less electric power, have fewer children, limit growth.
All of this was fueling this ideology that there's too many people on the planet, there's not enough resources, and that something has to be done.
The natural world in which man lives and on which he depends is indeed deteriorating, is being destroyed in many instances at a rate that is accelerating and that can only continue to accelerate unless we begin to control the activities that are having this destructive impact.
In 1975, the Club of Rome published a second report, Mankind at the Turning Point. The lead quotation was telling.
The world has cancer, and the cancer is man.
The report concluded,
the solution of these crises can be developed only in a global context with full and explicit recognition of the emerging world system, a new world economic order, and a global resources allocation system.
In other words, technocracy. Top-down control of everything, including populations. But if that was the solution, a worldwide problem was required. Climate change provided the answer, as admitted in a later Club of Rome document.
This is the quote from page 115. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behaviour that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. It really does look as though they are inventing climate change there.
They just made it up out of thin air, literally. That nobody really looks at that book and say, well, there you go. It's not, this has nothing to do with science whatsoever. They just made it up.
Interestingly, in 1988, Maurice Strong had been instrumental in establishing the IPCC, the mainly political entity which endorsed a thesis by a small group of scientists that industrial carbon dioxide was driving climate change, and the IPCC has been looked into that theory ever since. Maurice Strong's masterstroke came in 1992, when as Secretary-General of the UN's Earth Summit in Brazil, he saw 179 nations commit to a world action plan, Agenda 21.
We have been the most successful species ever. We are now a species out of control.
Nobody would question the need for a cleaner environment and the protection of nature, and Strong's legacy lives on through the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Accord, the current Agenda 2030, and the worldwide push for carbon net zero. But there are questions on his motives and his connections. He was behind the first financial carbon market and a founding director of the World Economic Forum. Surely a conflict of interests, with his involvement in the IPCC. A skeptic might ask why nearly all research grants in almost 40 years have gone on developing IPCC carbon dioxide theories, while anyone who raises questions is ridiculed, cancelled, or has their career stalled.
Funding for someone who wants to determine the natural variability of the climate system as an explanation for what has happened is just not there. I mean, the government is very clear that they want a catastrophic story.
There is no single science paper that proves conclusively that humans control all or most of the global climate. If there was, you wouldn't hear the last of it. Instead, we get this call to authority to the IPCC, the United Nations Panel on Climate Change.
Many more scientists and academics are speaking out against the IPCC. Almost 2,000 have signed a declaration stating that there is no climate emergency, including Nobel Prize winner Professor John Clauser, who wrote,
"The popular narrative about climate change reflects a dangerous corruption of science that threatens the world's economy and the well-being of billions of people."
We need to have a full and honest debate about the science. It needs to be discussed in Parliament, it needs to be discussed in the media, it needs to be generally discussed, and we need to sort of bring the drains up, if you like, on all of the science to see what is there really a threat.
That debate is highly unlikely, because the juggernaut of net zero careers on, with trillions at stake. What is certain is that the repercussions will affect the food we eat, ravage our countryside, and have a disastrous impact on our energy supply.
If you cannot set a credible course for net zero with 2025 and 2030 targets covering all your operations, you should not be in business.
Well, net zero is insanity. It's pure insanity. I mean, the idea that you can remove 85% of the world's energy, which comes from hydrocarbons, within less than 30 years and replace it with the sunbeams and the breezes, it shows a complete lack of economics, societal effect. It shows a simple lack of the progress that we made over 300 years.
Nevertheless, net zero is enshrined in UK law, with the government passing the Climate Change Act in 2008. A 100% reduction in emissions by 2050 from 1990 levels was included later in a strategy document. But experts argue that the policy is fatally flawed.
Europe's mad dash towards net zero is effectively economic suicide. Politicians are purposely impoverishing ordinary people, purposely deindustrializing Europe, where companies are forced to move to countries where they have access to cheap energy, whether it's the US who frack and therefore have cheap gas, or whether it's to China, which is still predominantly producing from non-renewable, especially coal. It is literal economic suicide.
China continues to open new coal-fired power stations to drive the factories that manufacture wind turbines and solar panels, which are then sold to the West. As a result, China emits almost 30% of global greenhouse gases, while the UK is responsible for less than 1%. In essence, carbon emissions are merely transferred to another part of the planet, and while China gets richer, UK households face a bleak and expensive future.
What it will effectively do is price ordinary people out of having access to electricity at a time they want, at a price they can afford.
The core problem is that neither the infrastructure nor the technology exist to provide a constant supply of electricity.
The proportion of time that solar actually generates electricity is actually 9% in the UK. That means that for 90% of the time, solar doesn't generate the average amount of electricity that its capacity can generate. For onshore wind, it's about 20 to 40%, and for offshore wind, it's about 30 to 50%. So that means, by definition, you will always have periods of time when renewables aren't producing electricity, but there is demand for electricity.
As we'll hear, the net result is that supply will be rationed. Reality, though, seems not to concern the activists.
look at some of these hysterical youngsters and some of the hysterical oldsters as well, screaming about the climate is collapsing and all that sort of thing. And you think you haven't got a clue what would happen if you removed hydrocarbons. You haven't got a clue. You'd be back in service, like probably your ancestors were. You'd be skivvying on the land, in big houses with warlords, calling themselves aristocracy and all that sort of stuff. You want to go back to that? Fine. Get rid of hydrocarbons.
Many of these apparently grassroots protest groups are backed by organisations such as the Climate Emergency Fund, financed by billionaires like the oil heiress Aileen Getty. And if they claim to be environmentalists, they conveniently ignore the bigger picture. Thousands of wind turbines are disrupting coastal waters, changing habitats, affecting marine life, and killing seabirds. Landscapes are being scarred by the production of lithium for electric car batteries, and by cobalt mines in Africa, where child labour contributes to huge corporate profits. How does the loss of thousands of square miles of farmland to vast solar parks meet the UN's biodiversity goal? And how helpful are wind turbines when they're blotting the landscape visually and through noise pollution, and disrupting wildlife in the air and on the ground? The glorious mountain terrain of southwest Wales is a stark example. It's a landscape breathtaking in its beauty, untainted and largely untouched by humans. A haven for wildlife, a place where life runs its natural course. Yet this is what's planned. Mega turbines designed for offshore, reaching 700 feet into the air and dwarfing the hilltop forests. Planning permission is being sought for the so-called Bryn Cadwyn Energy Park.
If you put one in the valley floor, it would be standing some 40 metres above the valley floor, so above the horizon. But they're not putting them in the valley floor, they're putting them on the top of the hills. So it'll be standing some 600 odd metres above sea level up there, casting a shadow over our solar panels.
Justin Cotter lives right in the centre of the proposed development. He's fighting to preserve the countryside he loves. And across the mountain, Jason and Josie Barker are equally aggrieved.
It feels very much like it's exploitation, using the climate crisis narrative as its supporting evidence. So it feels like it's being abused in a tremendous way. And there's going to be a lot of destruction done in the name of doing good, which really just seems utterly backwards. And if we really want to protect nature, then some of the best way of doing that would be to leave it well alone, especially in the wilder places, and let it flourish. We certainly found that being here. The more we've lived here, the more we've worked with it and encouraged it, the more it's come back. All of those spruce trees on top there, they will have to go to make way for turbines. All of that. All of this spruce will be gone.
To build a 230-metre turbine in that location, it's going to take some crane to lift the 240-ton nacelle onto the top of the tower, some 180 metres up. So they'd have to stabilise all the ground for the crane, stabilise the ground for the actual turbine, put in a concrete plug basically in the ground of some 1,000 tonne of steel, 4,000 tonne of concrete, just as a base.
They'll need to be lit. It'll take away the dark skies.
It's totally devastating. It would just be catastrophic damage and destruction.
The roadways up through these valleys, they're Welsh valleys, they're all twists and turns. They're going to have to straighten out the valleys. Where you've got steep hills, they're going to have to level out those hills. There's a 200-metre drop into the actual valley itself. So they're going to have to create gradients that machinery carrying 400-tonne loads can actually traverse and get up.
The locals argue that there are much better ways of creating clean energy, such as solar panels on industrial sites. Areas of natural beauty should be respected.
This is about preserving and protecting this sacred land. We need to speak up and protect the environment.
It's just a tremendous amount of damage in the name of saving the planet. It does make you ask the question of what is it we're actually saving if we're paving it over. It doesn't make any sense at all in my head.
The proliferation of turbines and solar panels certainly seems at odds with protecting biodiversity, and experts argue that the economics simply don't add up.
The panel certainly seems at odds with protecting biodiversity, and experts argue that the economics simply don't add up.